Our first speaker this morning is Katie Robinson Edwards, who is the curator of the Umlauf Sculpture Garden and Museum in Austin, Texas. A decade after publication of her Midcentury Modern Art Texas book, Katie revisits the theme of modernism in 20th century and 21st century Texas art and makes a plea for why early Texas art enthusiasts should embrace it. I think from the, if you take a look at the dealers in there, we have in fact embraced modernism. Thank you, Katie, but your book was an eye-opener back then. Katie Robinson Edwards is a curator and executive director of the Sculpture Garden in Austin, Texas. She organizes exhibitions and manages a vast collection of American artist Charles Umlauf's work. She was previously an assistant professor of art history at Baylor University. Her essay on Andrew Wyeth and Jackson Pollock appears in Rethinking Andrew Wyeth. Her Mid-Century Modern Art in Texas, UT Press, won the Cassetta Book Award and the Award of Merit for Nonfiction from the Philosophical Society of Texas in 2015. She has also contributed long essays to catalogs on Chuck Close, Farrah Fawcett, yes, that Farrah Fawcett, Jackson Pollock, Robert Rauschenberg, Jessica Stockholder, Richard Stout, Charles Williams, Andrew Wyeth, and Jamie Wyeth. She served on the boards for Cassetta and Generous Art. Will you welcome Katie Edwards?
Thank you. It is very nice to be here, very nice to be back at Cassetta in Dallas, and I am really honored to be part of this remarkable lineup. We have a veritable pantheon of speakers. And yesterday's talk by Sue Canterbury, wherever you are, was incredible. Fantastic, interesting, and also bittersweet, and contains lessons for us all. But I also want to give you a warning, which is that my talk totally loses the plot around slide 59 or 60. And so at some point, for various reasons, I tried a new system. I crammed too much in there. The slides weren't working properly. So at some point, we're just going to look at pretty pictures. See, I'm not kidding. So truly, bear with me. My prompt for today was to talk about what modernism is and what it means to early Texas art. This is something I addressed at length in my Mid-Century Modern Art in Texas from 2014, and I've revisited over the years in different ways in every exhibition I do, but also in David Kataforis's book that Jeff mentioned, that excellent book on Andrew Wyeth, which you all should have. And also, I was very proud to be one of the contributors to Ron Tyler's monumental 2019 exhibition catalog, The Art of Texas 250 Years. There is also abundant, excellent scholarship by many, many people that takes a chronological and a very deep approach and does it in many ways. And I am not doing a chronological region by region, city by city outline of the modernism in Texas at all. It may drive you crazy, but I just wanted to do something different. And also, because recently I've been spending as curator for the last 10 years and now director, spending a lot more time, even more time handling art, living with it day and night at work and at home, and becoming even more of an advocate and really thinking more about the experiential experience of staring at paintings, which I've had the pleasure of doing with some of you fairly recently. So I want to take us on a trip through early Texas art based on themes and some issues that matter, and just kind of thinking about how it affects us as viewers, but also maybe think about what our artists were responding to and what they're still doing. When we talk about modernism with a capital M, we are referring to the cultural movement that emerged from Europe in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. In the most basic sense, modernism is a result of increased industrialization since the 19th century. As we shifted from an agrarian to an industrial society, rural and urban centers began to change. New materials mean newer styles, new buildings are erected, new modes of architecture, modes of transportation and especially communication become more advanced, and people's social and work relationships change dramatically. In fact, everything in the modern world seems to move increasingly faster. And as an aside, change today may be occurring at a pace that is faster than human beings can keep up with. The culture of modernism, when we talk about it in general, is marked by an increased self-consciousness, restlessness, and an interest in documenting change. We're going to put up some classic kind of school-marmy examples here. Edward Manet's Olympia, 1863, in the Musée d'Orsay, and Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Manet's Olympia was pivotal to the development of modern art, for challenging established conventions and for paving the way for later modernist movements. Manet's friend, the poet and art critic Charles Baudelaire, had advocated for an art that could capture, quote, the gait, glance, and gesture of modern life. So in one highly complex painting there on your left, Manet radically departs from traditional academic painting while offering an unflinching portrayal of a contemporary subject, a modern-day courtesan. Exhibited in 1865 at the Salon des Refusés in Paris, Manet's painting was shocking and vulgar. He depicts a prostitute who also happened to be personally recognized by many of the visitors to the Salon des Refusés. And she stares at the viewer with a direct, unidealized, and unflinching gaze. These are not bedroom eyes. These are transactional eyes. Olympia is seen as a key work in modern art for its rejection of idealization, its contemporary subject matter, the use of broad, visible brushstrokes, and the way it challenges the viewer, and also particularly for its influence on other modernist movements. Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon, on your right, decades later, but deeply attentive to the stir caused by Manet's Olympia, Picasso ups the ante. At age 25, the Spanish immigrant to France soaks in his new environment. He mixes Cézanne's structuring of space, planes, and subject matter with his own fascination with the primal power of Iberian, Oceanic, and African masks that he knew from street stalls and from France's Museum of Ethnography. The title, Demoiselles d'Avignon, directly alludes back to a street in Barcelona known for its prostitutes. Picasso's own ambivalent relationship with women, power, and sexuality literally takes center stage. While modernism and abstraction have been progressing rapidly in Europe, and especially in Paris, it's a bit slower to develop in America. In 1913, a small group of American artists brought a massive exhibition of nearly 1,300 works by 300 artists, most of whom were European painters and sculptors, and this was the infamous International Exhibition of Modern Art, also known as the Armory Show. Over 80,000 people visited the exhibition in New York before it traveled to Chicago and Boston, where it got hundreds of thousands of visitors overall. The single most pilloried work, there's the interior of it with the little button. The single most pilloried work in the entire show was Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase on the right, most famously described by an American critic as an explosion in a shingle factory. It was the first large exhibition of modern art in America, and it had wide-ranging and long-lasting effects. But there already existed movements toward modernism in America, especially by artists who had traveled abroad. Heard a lot about them from Sue's wonderful talk. And this painting by Robert Henry on the left was in the Armory Show and feels very tame next to the Duchamp. Henry is best known as the leader of a group of anti-establishment artists whose 1908 New York Gallery exhibition led to the formation of what's called the Ashcan School, one of the earliest modernist movements in American art. What you see here in the left side, Robert Henry portrait of Willie G. is much looser brushwork. a willingness not to polish the subject, who in this case is also very common. It's a newspaper boy. And then the Bellows paintings, both of them, those are two of them, on the right are Ashcan schools that depict gritty scenes in New York. Very different from academic style painting. Modernism does not have to be abstract, although it often is. And on your upper left, you've got Kandinsky's Improvisation 27, Garden of Love, Arthur Dove at lower left, Sails, and Stanton McDonald writes Synchrony in purple minor. So two Americans at right and lower left, and a Russian who became a Frenchman. We can have abstraction. We're just looking at these for styles, really. We can have abstraction grounded in figuration, as in the painting by Stanton McDonald Wright on the right, or abstraction that seems to have very little basis in the visible world, as in the Russian-born French artist Kandinsky at top left. And that Kandinsky painting was included in the Armory show, and it's now in the Met. At the lower left is Sails by the American Arthur Dove. Perhaps one of our first modernist abstract painters in America, which was exhibited in Alfred Stieglitz's pioneering 291 gallery the year before the Armory show. In Dove's case, we are guided by the title, Sails, to identify some of the very sharp organic forms, but otherwise you wouldn't necessarily know. It would look fairly abstract. Even deeply abstract art is always rooted in something, the essential elements of color, form, line, shape, or the medium of sculpture, stone, plastic, steel, or bronze. The Dutch avant-garde painter Theo van Doesburg put forth the preferred term concrete art, that didn't really stick, by which he meant that it is the representation of something that was previously not visible, not palpable. Concrete art translates abstract ideas into reality so that they can be perceived. So that's, a lot of people say nothing's happening or nothing's going on, but obviously the artists are thinking that they are translating something into reality. Abstract artists often point out that their work is more real and has a more concrete quality, a presentness. This is New York. In 1929, the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, opens to the public in a rented space in Midtown Manhattan with Alfred H. Barr as its founding director and the man responsible for much of its collecting practices for the next couple decades. Even when he hires curators, he still has a heavy hand in it. For a major exhibition of Cubism and abstract art in 1936, Barr creates a chart of modern art. Now, Barr's Eurocentric chart, in fact, much of MoMA's modern and so-called primitive art trailblazing, has been heavily criticized, revisited, and rebelled against by artists and critics ever since. But for our purposes, and also in 1929, it was an earnest attempt at creating a taxonomy that had a wide-reaching impact. And he's trying to make sense of something that is hard to make sense of. Another thing that happens at the Museum of Modern Art that I think is really interesting in terms of figuration and abstraction and representation is that the Museum of Modern Art in New York purchases Jackson Pollock's She-Wolf right after his first solo exhibition at Peggy Guggenheim's gallery, the Art of the Century gallery, before she moves off to Europe and switches him over to Betty Parsons. In May 1944, they acquire She-Wolf for a discounted price of, guess how much? Oh, almost exactly, $600. Excellent. So you'd be in pretty good shape if you had that. And then, this is what I think is so interesting, and this is what I write about in that Cataphorus book, but because to me this is like it's very essential to the history of modernism. In 1949, MoMA purchases this painting, Christina's World by Andrew Wyeth, for $1,800. Pretty expensive. From his sold-out show. I think he was at Macbeth Gallery. No, he was at a different gallery. I can't remember where he was. But that first show completely sold out. And Wyeth, also modern, is seen as modern by MoMA. It's a very seemingly tranquil landscape, but as with so much of Wyeth's oeuvre, There's another story beneath the surface that you probably know. The subject, Anna Christina Olsen, had a degenerative muscular disorder and was unable to walk, and she was firmly against using a wheelchair, so she would crawl everywhere. And once you know that, you think about the painting completely differently, and you notice that her elbow and knuckles have what may be slight deformations. And I've always thought that the purchase of these two paintings in the same decade, very close, was because MoMA was hedging their bets. They were saying, what style of art would it take to really get the United States on the map and take over from Europe, from the dominance of Europe? And that is really their mission. And as I mentioned, Wyatt was selling out his shows on day one, and the Pollock is the hot new abstractionist. This is before he gets into his drip style. I also want to talk about these two works in terms of medium. Pollock is using, he's not yet discovered aluminum paint. That's not going to happen until 1947, but he is using house paint, over-the-counter paint, and house paint brushes. Wyatt is working in tempera, a very old-fashioned medieval type of painting that involves egg yolk and pigment, and that's what he is so excellent at and what he trained so many people in. So it's a completely different approach, a much slower, deliberate approach to painting as well. So Wyeth and Pollock could not be more distinct from each other visually and in terms of medium, but they are both distinctively modern, and that's exactly what MoMA thought and what they still think today, and they still have that hanging. It's also not as if the earlier or more conservative strains of art ever disappeared. They will always be around. And certainly in Texas, much art remains relatively conservative, at least compared to the New York school painting that we'll see briefly. One of the things that can be confusing about modernism is that if something happens to be made during the modern era, then by historical circumstance, it will be modern. And this is with a little lowercase m. But I also think sometimes that if you take a close look at much of what was made during the modern age, you will also find big M modernism, which is what makes it so fun. You will find people responding to their environment, responding to other paintings, or doing little strange things. Bars, I know you can't see that on the right at all because it is incredibly pale, so don't worry about it. But that is Jerry Bywater's Tree of Modern Art. Barr's taxonomy of abstract art had a huge effect on Jerry Bywaters, who began his tenure as director of the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts in 1943, where he works for 20-plus years. And I know you can barely see it, but he carefully works out a tree of Texas art, including dozens of artists and their styles, directly after trying to look. He's got Barr's catalog for the 1936 exhibition open, and he's trying to figure this out. Dozens of artists and their styles, and they become the leaves. And at the roots, the ground are the Europeans. Then moving up the trunk are academic foreign painters with big branches for cattle paintings, historical pioneer subjects, impressionists, regionalists, internationalists, abstractionists, as he calls them, graphic media, among others. And on one regional leaf, he circles the name Alexander Hogue. Hogue, was, like Bywaters, is also a member of the so-called Dallas Nine Regionalist Artists, and he also offers a chance to present a conundrum about how Texas artists can be modern. When we speak of modernism in Texas art, we encounter an intriguing paradox. How does a movement, modernism, that is fundamentally concerned with breaking from tradition and embracing urban industrial modernity take root in a state that was still largely defined by its frontier mythology and rural landscapes? Texas modernism emerges as many artists negotiated between cosmopolitan artistic languages learned in New York and Paris and elsewhere, and the specific realities of their Southwestern context. And rather than simply importing European avant-garde techniques, these artists forged a distinctly regional modernism that addressed the rapid urbanization, oil booms, geographic and cultural shifts that were reshaping Texas throughout the 20th century. This regional modernism finds some of its very compelling expressions in the work of artists who refuse to choose between local subject matter and formal innovation, like Hogue. Hogue turns a critical eye toward progress in the Southwest. His stark depictions of Dust Bowl devastation use a quasi-precisionist technique and startling iconography that ensures that we can't look away. His iconic and dramatic painting, Mother Earth Laid Bare, that you've been looking at, of 1936, implicates the viewer. And that implication, pulling in of the viewer so that they can't just relax like they can with a beautiful painting of flowers or a landscape, or an old-fashioned landscape, I should say, that's a key hallmark of European modernism. In the same way that the people who are now the classic modernists, Edouard Manet and Pablo Picasso and even Cézanne did. Consider how all three paintings also use women as a method of conveying meaning. With Manet and Picasso, the main female forms confront us. That's maybe one of the most disturbing things about it, that people were all struck by immediately. They are presented in a way that says, fear me or back off, but it also feels defensive and deflective on both artists' parts. They were both very involved in this relationship with the people in the paintings. There's plenty of fear in the Hogue painting, but his Earth Mother is passive, implicating the viewer through the raping plow in the foreground, and that makes the viewer very complicit in the landscape. And we are intended to worry for the future of this desolate land. All three paintings entwine the viewer, making him, and I use the male pronoun advisedly, involved in the painting. Prostitution is a dominant subtext of both Manet and Picasso, and violent male physicality also pervades the Hogue. There's no way to disentangle oneself from becoming complicit, and all the figures are in some way accusatory. And again, I'm emphasizing this because this is what modern art does to you. You've got a relationship with it. The Hogue was painted in 1936, the year of the Texas Centennial, a year of celebrating our state's progress. As the Philbrook's chief curator, Catherine Whitney, has argued, progress promised for a better tomorrow, but it also began to stir growing fears. What were the unseen threats that the industrial expansions posed to the natural environment, once considered America's pristine symbol of promise and collective pride? How might society be changed for better or for worse? There's a lot more about these paintings to explore, particularly with the use of the male and female form and the way both Manet and Picasso, the paintings are so forcibly frontal, while the Hogue landscape recedes, like we see a lot of Texas art do, with a seemingly passive female form, yet she is earth, and the warning he issues, to me at least, seems even more dire. In the rear right corner, Hogue includes a dead tree, drawing another symbol of desolation. And these trees appear in countless Texas paintings and are multivalent. This is definitely not the Bywater's taxonomical tree, but it's yet another ominous sign in this case. And just as with European modernism, in America, of course, artists interpret modernism in a variety of ways, with many artists turning toward abstraction. One American critic who had an outsized influence championing abstraction, but a very particular kind, is this fellow in this photograph by Hans Nemeth. A defining argument made by the legendary pugilistic American art critic Clement Greenberg, a controversial figure who made an outsized impact on mid-century American art, his argument is that since the mid-19th century, the arts in general begin to be more and more defined by the boundary of each specialty. So, music becomes more about sound itself. Think of Arnold Schoenberg and the abandonment of harmonic structure. The novel becomes more about words. Think about James Joyce, 1922, Ulysses, which sometimes is just words. and stream of consciousness, which is an important part, the interior mind getting onto the page. And painting and sculpture for Greenberg become more and more about the medium with which they are made, about materiality. All art forms were changed by modernism, but the degree of change in the visual arts seems especially strong, and that may be because I don't know enough about music. But especially in visual art, as art begins to veer far away from depicting the visible world around us. Greenberg becomes almost comically adamant about this. He writes and lectures about how modern art does not have a choice except to retreat to what it is made of. In other words, it's a trajectory that it's just on a path for, and that's the way he talks about, he'll do the whole history of art, and that basically painting has to only be about paint. And this does matter because he is the executor of David Smith's estate when David Smith dies unexpectedly. David Smith, a great sculptor, and David Smith had planned on painting some of his big steel sculptures, and he did paint some of them. But as executor, Greenberg said, oh, no, you can't paint sculpture because paint belongs with paintings and steel belongs with sculpture. So it makes a difference in literally in the history of art. Greenberg is opinionated for sure, but his assertions happened when historical circumstances allowed him to make a larger-than-life impact, and it has lasted. New York was indeed a nexus, but the tastemakers were actually confined to a very, very small geographical area, as I'm kind of pointing out here, not just Manhattan, but lower Manhattan. Greenberg and others, like particularly Harold Rosenberg, but Rosenberg's totally different from Greenberg, promote a group of mostly male painters known as the New York School. Why abstract expressionism, which is the name it begins to be called, takes over is partly because the squeakiest wheel got the grease. And despite the writings and theorizing that were happening very actively in Texas, lots of activity, Texas was just too far away from what became the center of the art world. And it just didn't stand a chance, at least not in the mid-century. But a lot of, particularly Dorothy Miller, Alfred Barr's chosen curator at the Museum of Modern Art, comes down to Texas and starts plucking out artists like Jack Boynton. She starts finding artists and bringing them back to New York because they're looking for the next new discovery. But they got to bring them back to New York, which doesn't always work out. And the whole story about how abstract expressionism takes over, just a quick, if you don't know what the artwork looks like, which of course you do, going clockwise from the top left, we've got Barnett Newman, Clifford Still, Robert Motherwell, then going around Jackson Pollock, a couple of de Koonings, and then Barnett Newman. It was interesting, just the other day we were installing an exhibition in our gallery and I was getting help from our museum facilities assistant, Gustavo Estrado, who's actually from Mexico, and I heard him telling the intern that Jackson Pollock was paid to make modern painting by the US government. And that actually, and I was like, Gus, where'd you get that from? And it's just something that he has picked up, which was fascinating to me, which probably stems from this famous book by Serge Guilbeault, the Canadian author who called How New York Stole the Idea of Modern Art. But it was so interesting to hear it from Gustavo in the gallery there. And he wasn't even talking to me. I just let him have that one, so, because it's great. Pollock did not have that much money. He did not get paid. And there's Pollock in his studio. Some Texas artists, like the great Myron Stout, who's from Denton, don't see their style as fitting in with any of these artists, nor Myron Stout also did not feel like he fit with a regionalist figurative group. Painting images of women or overt landscapes or expressing himself through expansive gestural abstraction like Pollock was not Myron Stout's thing. He does hang out with the ab-exers. He gains thrilling insight from people like Hans Hofmann that he studied with and Robert Motherwell, seen here on the right. but he is not much interested in the womanizing the bars or the big, noisy painting. He does study with Hans Hofmann, the great German émigré, is that right? Who spends a lot of time teaching in New York at a couple of places and then also in Provincetown and teaches many, many, many people. And Myron Stout ends up moving permanently to Provincetown, where Stout feels more comfortable for reasons that we don't need to get into but are really vital and worth exploring elsewhere. So Stout turns inward. In other words, some of our early Texas artists do not look to be, you'll see you're not looking at Stout. Now you are. Some of our early Texas artists do not appear to be Texan or Southwestern at all, although there's kind of a funny, silly thing in a minute. But it is really, and I would argue, it really is the freedom, the expansive space of his upbringing in North Texas that Stout internalizes, that it allows him to turn inward, to make these paintings that would take him years sometimes to make. That's Hierophant, and then I'm also showing you Aegis. They just look terrible in reproduction. There's just no way around it, but you got the sizes there. And so the paintings the borders are black, that white edge is from the image. Stout is born in Denton in 1908. He makes an early decision to be a painter, but he doesn't really become so until the late 1940s, after he'd been in World War II. He got his MA from Columbia University, and he was continuing on for a doctorate so he could teach art appreciation. And then he heard about a drawing class taught by Hans Hofmann on 8th Street, and that was life-changing. Meeting and studying with Hofmann motivated Stout to fully recommit himself to painting. Between 47 and 52, he studies with Hofmann intermittently, maybe for about 2 total years. He withdrew from New York in 1952 and moves to Provincetown, Massachusetts, where he lives in very modest circumstances until 1987. He does not have a large output. He was known to have spent many, many years on a single easel painting. His biographer, B.H. Friedman, also did a biography of Pollock. In 1980, Friedman does Myron Stout's Whitney Museum retrospective. Stout's paintings have a physicality and a texture that evokes both the speed of light and the slow passage of time. And what B.H. Friedman says is he has made from his deepest feelings what amount to ritual objects so physical, so full of the grain and texture of life that they suggest metaphysical photographs taken somehow simultaneously at the dazzling speed of light and at the slow, grinding pace of eternity. Stout reads extensively, and he writes journals that you can purchase. They're excellent. In October 13th, 1965, he notes what he's reading when he writes this. And he says he's reading John A. Wilson's Culture of Ancient Egypt, pre-modern for sure. And he even says, he says, I really like page I-7 and the whole first chapter. He says, the discussion of the effect of geographical environment on the Egyptians brings to mind my own cogitations on same with regard to myself. And I'll read you this Stout quote. He says, I think it was only when I came fully alive, so to speak, as a painter, when I had worked with Hans, that the effect on me of the flatness of my native environment had affected my imagination so powerfully. The flatness, or rather the successively endless, low-rolling character of North Texas and of all the areas of Texas that I went to in my young years had the effect of giving promise in every direction. Things and likewise affairs, whatever I was aware of and that concerned me, extended out possibly every direction of thought and possibility, but they extended predominantly in a single plane, horizontally. Except for various structures, such as county courthouse and the grain elevators and such, I never climbed more than to the second story. My habitat, my familiar known plane of existence was the ground. and there was a a small exhibition at Craig's Star Gallery of Stout's paintings. I should have had that up because they look much better when they're on the wall. They look much better in real life. And that one on the right might look familiar to me, at least, because that's actually the cover of my book. And I laugh because whenever anybody sees that, and they also know that I live in Austin, they think it's Longhorns, which is not what he meant. And in fact, the designer of the book first put the words in the middle of the U and got a big no-no for the copyright. We were not allowed to use it from the Stout estate until she fixed it. But anyhow, fantastic painting owned by the one on the right by the Museum of Modern Art. I'm actually not sure where the one on the left is, but I might have written it down. I want to go backwards and do something strange here, something I've been thinking about. As we've seen, the influence on American art in this area was largely European. We know some of our modernists, Charles T. Williams, with his Odalisque 1954, which he's looking at Henry Moore, but because he's looking at Henry Moore and because Henry Moore is looking at Chacmool figures in Central America, Williams takes a trip down there with Octavio Medellin, and also Jerry Bywaters a lot of our artists go down to Mexico. Edmund Kinzinger does too, and of course a lot of our New Mexicans. They take trips and inspiration from Mexico and Central America, which is not Europe, to great positive effect. And I've talked about that in the past and in a long section in my book, and it's something eventually I want to revisit again. Another Charles Williams that's in San Antonio that our taco group will go greet. We have an Austin taco group now. You're welcome to join us. And Tony Lassell was a very good friend, very, very good friend, also from Denton, also in Provincetown, very good friend of Hoffman and of Myron Stout, and that is my favorite painting of all time, called Puritan, which I don't know what it means, I made it up. I think that she is using that title because she's taking a kind of what she thinks of as a puritanical approach to the form, but Sarah will tell us more about that. And I just put a couple in. Some of these are I have a lot of just eye candy in here. We're going to do something weird, but this isn't where I go off the rails yet. That comes later. I want to turn to the dominance of perspective in the Western world because we keep saying modernism, starts in Europe, and it comes over here. So much more going on in the world, as we know. And perspective, linear perspective, is one of the major tenets that actually gets overturned during modernism deliberately because they're tired of the stranglehold that linear perspective has on them. And they, of course, have a huge potent impact on American early 20th century, mid-century art. So I want to just go back and look at just a couple of very, very pre-modernist works and the invention of linear perspective in Italy. And as I said, most of our Texas artists were looking to Europe for inspiration, and that's what's taught in schools, what the magazines were publishing, and what was in some exhibitions that some of them were familiar with, like the 1936 Texas Centennial Exhibition. So this is Duccio's Annunciation, which it happens to be in egg tempera, the same medium that Wyeth uses. In it, the Holy Spirit, this is neat, right? This is Gabriel announcing that she is pregnant, that she's going to have a baby, and it's actually the moment that the Word becomes flesh. This is what these annunciations are about. And here she is dutifully reading her Old Testament, telling her that she's, forecasting that she's going to have a baby. And Gabriel comes in, and it has this crazy, crazy perspective. And but it works, right? It's just a learned visual perspective, and it works beautifully, and it's very effective. And this really is a kind of, well, obviously it's a religious painting. It's in a church, but it's something that you reflect on, that you spend time with, just the way Myron Stout does. But you have a deeper meaning. You have a profound deeper meaning. This is the most exciting moment, and literally the word becoming flesh, and then the word becoming flesh in painting, which is really cool. Linear perspective, though, comes along. They're kind of messing with it a little bit, but it's essentially invented by Filippo Brunelleschi and demonstrated at the Florence Baptistry. I'm not showing you that. But linear perspective is therefore artificial. It's invented to render 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface, and you usually have to look at, like, use one eye if you're going to do linear perspective. So what I'm saying is that it's invented and creative to give an illusion, and it's stuck for centuries to be unseated when photography comes in, which is one of the technological advances that leads to European modernism. Oh, there you go. You see that? So the most famous example is in Raphael's School of Athens, and we've got some crazy lines coming at you. Now, Raphael is literally taking the book from Brunelleschi and putting it into this painting, and it almost feels very stiff, in fact, and it also has a whole who's who of people in it. But that takes over, and that takes over for a lot of the painting. So then I was looking at this again, this beautiful Brewer-Utter painting of cloisters, which doesn't have, it has its own fictive, it's modernist, Fort Worth School, Brewer-Utter. This is in that wonderful Intimate Modernism exhibition, and it's in the Fort Worth Museum. And he's not abiding by linear perspective at all. He's just doing what he wants to do. I don't know what he's looking at, but it's one of the most beautiful paintings. But it does so happen that a lot of these early Italian artists were in the 1936 centennial. And the names aren't right. Like, they had the names wrong during the centennial because a lot of those were misattributed, so I don't actually know exactly who it is. Somebody does, not me. And there's another one, some of the examples of some of the things that people could see. And sort of my point about this is that artists are sponges, and they just pick up everything. In fact, that is my thesis, that artists are sponges. And so, also, I was thinking about McKee Trotter. Obviously, it just visually looks the same, but there's no perspective, no landscape on this wonderful McKee Trotter, Entrance to the Fair, 1954. There's the drawing for it. Nothing like beach castles, same kind of idea. Just form, texture, beautiful color, beautiful design, and a very peaceful setting. So artists, especially so many of our early Texas artists, are sponges. They absorb everything around them, the landscape, the magazines, other people's art, the new paints, the food. It's all fodder for art. And often, modern art involves abandoning some of the earlier forms, abandoning centuries of craft or technical skill. And that doesn't necessarily mean a predetermined path, a foregone conclusion that modern painting has to be flat. There's all kinds of stuff you can do with it, especially when you already have a flat landscape all around you. You don't need to follow Greenberg if you just look around you the way Myron Stout said in this wonderful Florence McClung Lancaster Valley. Here's the plain, that plane of existence, the ground that Stout speaks of that so influences him, depicted by McClung. And then I just kind of thought about that in a lot of our landscapes. We know this, we who collect this, in the William Lester, Oklahoma Rocks, even in Charles Bowling, which does have pretty decent perspective in it, and in Trailerville, and I've shown this slide before, but I just love it because I think Charles Bowling is looking at Charles Adams when he makes that lithograph. He has to be. And then, we know that artists are looking at everything. Jim Love is looking at Bugs Bunny, at Which is now a banned cartoon. Warner Brothers won't show it anymore because it's kind of racist. Unintentionally, but a lot of racism is unintentional. And that's a copy after the Warner Brothers cartoon. Lester's Rock and Cedar, Spruce's Brushy Hillside, and Lauren Mosley's Winter Fields, oil on canvas. Not worrying about how, I mean, it's an atmospheric perspective, but it's not actually accurate the way you would do maybe a Renaissance atmospheric perspective at all. I think this is where we're going off the rails. So now's when you get to stick with me. I can't remember what number we're on. So that Lauren Mosley, I think he's absolutely looking at Andrew Wyeth. He's looking at everything around him too, because his Winter Fields has these dead birds on it, just like Andrew Wyeth's painting of the exact same title, which of course is tempera. He also puts oil, ink, and gesso on composition board on that one. Okay, now's the time when you guys just have to bear with me. Richard Stout's Paul, just abstract interpretation of space, doesn't look like abstract expressionism at all. Wonderful painter. James Brooks's Dallas painter, who does have quite a bit of success in New York, but an early work by him that's at the Blanton Oil Well at Sunset. Again, that expansive space all around him. I threw in this Frary Secret Totem just for fun. And I got those slides out of order. There's Pollock and James Brooks. So James Brooks was a good friend of Pollock's in Pollock's studio. And that's what Brooks ends up coming up with later. Again, all his own, much more abstract. And then going back to what I was showing you at the beginning, we can't forget that these artists are always also going back and looking at modernism and modernism before the Armory show, like this Olin Herman Travis, Bert Willoughby's Sportatorium, that he is definitely looking at Bellows' Stag at Sharkey's. And then here's where we're just having some eye candy here till I get to some other stuff. One of my all-time favorite, Robert Pruser, with some of his work. He is sort of in a class by himself. He studies with Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. He goes to Chicago. He is heavily, heavily influenced and shepherded by the very strong women artists of Houston, and eventually ends up going off to MIT and doing some really spectacular art and science work. That's probably one of my favorites. And if you look at it, yes, it's abstract, but it also seems to be kind of a Madonna and child figure inside that tonal oval. Once you see it, it's hard to unsee it. Umlauf does that a few times too. Forrest Bess, who we all, I hope, know and love, just totally on his own. And I really like this because I think Bess is looking at people who were hot in the day in the 50s, and he's looking at Jasper Johns' flag, and Bess is making his own version of the flag with that number untitled 11A that's in the MFA Houston. Jack Boynton, Bird Trap, fantastic use of space, and has the same sharp edges that you saw in the Dove earlier. And Aftermath, which is a terrible image. Actually, it's a very expensive image because they photographed that, but you just can't see it very well. Aftermath, it's almost predominantly black, but you can see a lot of Boynton's texture in there in his landscape. That's at the Whitney, that was purchased by the Whitney out of an exhibition. There's a detail that doesn't make it a whole lot better, but you can see very characteristic of Boynton out of Houston. Colwell, I just threw that in because I didn't want to leave him out. Seymour Fogel. So Fogel ends up getting hired by UT and comes, and he had worked on the World's Fair mural in 1939, and he was very dialed in fact. This is his conclave, 1950, and the point I'm trying to make with these is that he's got this whole series. There's red and black, a limestone painting. There's another limestone painting. And when when Fogel comes to Texas, he's teaching at University of Texas campus that has all these Paul Cray buildings and all of these buildings that are made with that fossiliferous limestone. And I have said it before, that it's a huge, I mean, obviously they're called limestone, but it's a huge impact on his painting. But it's very different when you actually look at the limestone that is surrounding him. And it's, when you cut it, these layers that should be horizontal that get used upright for building material all over Texas. And there's some more, and you can see where he's getting his designs from. So this is a true kind of regionalism, right? He's looking exactly at what's around him to make these very, very abstract and very beautiful paintings. And I think you even see it in things, once you see it and once you know, even though these aren't limestone paintings, the wonderful Icarian flight that he has, then you start to see that influence in how it changes his style. And then I just was having fun with some trees in here, and William Lester, carnival flags, again, that singular tree that is really a motif in Texas art. Okay, we're having a quick pause because I wanted to throw in a couple of other things. I hope I'm not too far over time. Melvin Edwards. Melvin Edwards. I didn't really know anything about Melvin Edwards when I wrote my book. I wish I had. My colleague at University of Texas at Austin, Kathy Kraft, has done incredible work on Edwards, and so have a lot of other people. He has been well plumbed. He is spoken for, but he's also quite old now. He's born in Houston in 1937. He attends E.O. Smith Junior High School, and he studies art with Miss Sadie Melton. And his father and a friend make his first easel. In 1950, which I think there he is. He goes to Phyllis Wheatley Senior High School, and he studies with Ethel Ladner. In 1953, he plays football. Edwards is one of the first two of Wheatley students that are selected to attend art classes at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. Then he goes to USC. He gets a scholarship to the LA County Institute, now the Otis Art Institute of Parsons School of Design, and he spends a lot of his career in LA and California, and then he comes back to Texas later. These are his most famous series that he does for a long time. They're called the Lynch Fragments, this series, Lynch Fragments, and this one is one of the they're incredible pieces, wall pieces that are welded, called Some Bright Morning, 1963, that's at the Hammer Museum. And this is just interesting to me, so you guys come along. I always thought people like John Biggers, I always thought they really don't do abstraction because it's so important to Biggers to represent the people around him in Houston and to teach people how to do people and how to do murals, and then he goes to Africa. And I always think it's sort of because they don't, because of what he's trying to achieve in a really difficult time to be an African American, the whole history of Texas Southern, he doesn't really have the ability. There's a luxury to make abstract art. You've got to have that ability. It's almost like having time. I'm not sure if that is a very good theory at all, but I always thought about that, about how important it was for Biggers and a lot of his students to really work figuratively beautiful, and they get very decorative and very abstract. And a lot of them also look like tapestries. And then Melvin Edwards says, abstraction to me probably means synthesis. Sculpture was more physical than painting. It seemed to me a more direct way to deal with the inner subject. Sculpture allowed me to put in a more natural way, things that people were saying you weren't supposed to put in art, like race and politics. It allowed me to think more literally in those ways, but have it come out in the work abstractly. And I've got a whole bunch more on him I'm not going to get into, but please, if you don't know his work, or I did not get to see the big, did anybody see the big Nasher show that Kathy put on? I unfortunately missed that too. And around the time Edwards finishes this piece, he comes across, actually another piece, he comes across a curious phrase in a book called 100 Years of Lynching by Ralph Ginsberg. And he recounts that during the area when incidents of lynching were increasing, African-American farm workers in a Florida community who were fighting for their rights received a threat from hostile white locals that they would be attacked on some bright morning. Fascinated by this chilling euphemism, Edwards used the phrase to title the very first wall piece and the ensuing series of released sculptures in lynched fragments. So what this makes me think of is artists, what Sue was talking about, who's going to be the keeper of the flame. Melvin Edwards kind of finally made it big, but probably when he was about 75, maybe. He's in his 90s now, and getting a lot of attention. But it took a while. It took a while. And it's just some incredible art. There he is playing football for the Phyllis Wheatley High School football team. Oh, so this Umlauf I have to put this in here because it's right outside our hotel, the Reclining Muse. Needs a little love, but gorgeous. It's really a wonderful piece. It's a unique casting. It's a Charles Umlauf sculpture, but when he won the Dallas Love Field Commission, which is the huge Spirit of Flight that's at Love Field with the fountain around it, he so dearly wanted to win that competition that he submitted 2 entries, anonymously, supposedly. And he won first place with Spirit of Flight and second place with something called the Seasons that then was never realized. He had only submitted models. So then eventually, when this was the Radisson, I think, they commissioned him to make the full-size version, and that's what you see. So it is a unique casting. And there he is in Italy, in Pietrasanta, working on that in a kind of a stage shot, sort of like the Pollock shot, but very, very different, although they are both very staged. But I also discovered another new artist who was an Umlauf student named Mary Page Huey that I had. She won't tell me how old she is. I actually think she's 95, which means she's not born in 1934. And she's amazing, powerhouse, works in stone. There's a detail of it. She does not like it that I call it a tail, but it is a beautiful, beautiful bronze work. She's an Umlauf student, and then she started teaching all around Austin and casting a lot after that. And she has this in her home. I have not seen it in real life. These are her photographs of it. But it's, again, somebody that needs some recognition because her work is really incredible. And she's kind of a bad A, can I say that here? Here she is in the 70s. She's a stone carver, and she teaches stone carvers that I actually work with at the Umlauf now. She taught them all. Just an incredible person. So again, let's discover and uncover these people and give them support. Even if they're 90, however old Mary Page is. She's so cute. She goes, I never thought I'd get old. And then Cedric Huckabee, that I think we will probably close on, the wonderful Cedric Huckabee. And I really wanted to put this in because when Cassetta was in Austin in 2000 and, when was that? 7, 8, 9? Ted Pillsbury was there, so that would be a date for us to figure out. And I had no idea who Cedric Huckabee was, and Ted Pillsbury got up and said, he is the artist you need to pay attention to. He is the greatest artist right now, which of course lots of people here, including Kevin Vogel, figured out pretty quickly. An amazing artist. And what I really like about him, he's also dealing with subject matter that used to be excluded, but that is now okay. And talk about a synthesis. Gone but Not Forgotten, Sha, which then is kind of fun because it's mirror image in its background. And then Little Sis, which you have seen really close to here. That's right over in David Dyke, so I was really happy to see that, so I threw that in there. And then this was in his most recent Tally Dunn exhibition, and one of the things that I always really liked about Cedric's work is, of course, how sculptural the painting is. He doesn't hold back at all. He doesn't have to abide by rules, and he builds them up really thickly. And I made a terrible, terrible attempt at showing you a little bit of the density and what it's like when you see it from the side. But I know you all know his work. He's wonderful. But again, and he's doing very well. But again, we want to keep an eye on our artists. We want to keep expanding it because they're all getting older, and so they will all soon be 40 years from the present day. And I also saw this that I had no idea about, that David Dykat. David, what's his name? I can't remember what his name is. Leon Lack. This incredible, incredible painting I had no idea about. This guy taught high school in Waco, and this is from 1954. African-American artists who delivered mail for a little bit and just stayed in Waco, and somehow this painting showed up. So get to your estate sales, get to your garage sales, clean them up like David did, and this is just a beautiful, beautiful painting. It would have been really fun to do some perspective lines on that one. Thank you very much.